As 2025 is upon us, I've got 5 questions for atheists in 2025.
Oh, I'm so happy! I'm so happy!
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Plank. I respond to various theological and ideological questions and claims from a rationalistic and naturalistic approach in an effort to give and explain the opposite viewpoint and help to balance the conversation. Well, Brax is back again. Braxton Hunter has started off the year with a bang and delivered unto us 5 more questions he would like to ask of atheists and non-believers in general. If you've been around my channel for a while, you may remember that Braxton's Questions for Atheists videos were some of the first videos I ever did for the channel a couple of years ago now. And when the same apologist makes multiple videos asking questions of the unfaithful, you at least know that they aren't going to repeat themselves from their previous questions. And so we can at least hope that these questions from Braxton today will not be the same questions that atheists have answered over and over again ad nauseum, that's just being repeated by a different apologist because they couldn't be bothered to go watch or read the hundreds or thousands of other times we've answered those exact questions. So let's ring in the new year and take a look at Braxton's 5 questions for atheists in 2025. But before we get to that, if you end up liking what you see in this video and would like to help out the channel, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so you'll always be notified when new content comes out. Check out my social media, including my Patreon, Twitter, and Blue Sky, all linked in the description. And of course, like the video, pop in a comment. All that goes a long way towards pleasing the YouTube algorithm. That magnanimous mind, mindful of marvels, meandering through meaningful musings, mastering magnificent morality, and maligning mystical morons, may keep my channel motoring along. Now on to today's video.
Question 1. Cameron Bertuzzi over at Capturing Christianity.
Are you okay?
I'm fine. I just threw up in my mouth a little bit.
Recently caused a lot of controversy by saying he no longer takes atheism seriously.
The reason why I don't take atheism seriously any longer is because even if we accept the atheist's strongest argument, it still wouldn't prove atheism.
Okay, I'm going to break this up a bit and take things as my responses to them come. So for starters, Cameron Bertuzzi and his refusal to take atheism seriously. So he says that the strongest atheist arguments, even if true, do not confirm or prove atheism correct. So for starters, atheism does not need to make any arguments whatsoever. Now, there certainly are arguments that come from all manner of non-believers that attempt to disprove the possibility of God, but those are not necessary to be an atheist. As I'm sure you're aware, Braxton, atheism is a disbelief or lack of belief in any god or gods. All it takes to be an atheist is to not be convinced of the existence of God. One need not make any arguments at all for that to be accomplished. Now, I poke a little fun at Cameron because he has a long history of refusing to accept or even seriously consider this fact. He likes to insist on atheism being the insistence that no God exists, and then maligning the lack of belief type of atheism, when he isn't ignoring us altogether, like he did in this little short from his channel. The point he's trying to make being that, hey, look at the cute hippo. Hippopotamuses lack a belief in God because they don't have the cognitive complexity to believe in a God in the first place, so that hippo is as much of an atheist as any lacktheist, a term he uses to make fun of the lack of belief in God position. But of course, the first part, the number one aspect necessary in order to be an atheist, is of course being a person, not a freaking hippopotamus. So I don't take Cameron Bertuzzi seriously because he refuses to acknowledge my philosophical position as an agnostic atheist even exists at all.
We have these really powerful arguments, at least from our perspective, on the theist side, like arguments from fine-tuning.
Fine-tuning is not a really powerful theistic argument. I mean, as an atheist, I don't think any theistic argument is really powerful at all, but fine-tuning is rather easily debunked in a number of ways. I mean, the idea that the rules and laws of the universe are just so ignores the notion that it may not even be possible for the rules and laws of the universe to be any other way than the way that they are. Assuming an equal chance for, say, the gravitational constant to be something other than it is an unfounded assumption. There's no evidence that it could even possibly be different. Then there's the fact that the universe is not really fine-tuned for anything beneficial to us, as would be the case with the idea of intelligent design, which designed the universe with us in mind. But take, for instance, physicist Lee Smolin, who said that if the universe were fine-tuned for anything, it's for the production of black holes. Well, black holes are not good for anything that we would consider life. Unless you think it sounds fun to be spaghettified.
Spaghettification is good. But what happens is, so these are what the forces would have you do if you were like Elastic Man. But as these forces want to stretch you, the stretching force will exceed the intermolecular forces that bind your flesh.
Oh boy.
So there's a point where the upper half of your body will snap away from the lower half of your body. And then those two halves will snap into two pieces.
Right.
They'll snap into two pieces. So because we are not rubber, we will snap into multiple pieces rather than stretch.
Yeah.
And then this will just continue until you're a stream of atoms descending into the cosmic abyss. And that's not even the worst part. You are also funneled down to a narrower and narrower thread.
Oh boy.
So a better word is that you're being extruded through the fabric of space.
Humans only exist on a relatively small part of one planet, and it's the only place that we know of that can support our kind of life. It's kind of hard to view that as fine-tuned. Also, the fine-tuning argument ignores the possibility of a multiverse, which would have countless universes with all different types of rules in place for each one of them. Sure, maybe most of which would have different rules and laws that do not allow for life to exist, but eventually, given enough universes, some would certainly have the proper conditions for life. And then whatever life evolves on those universes might sit there thinking that their universe had been finely tuned for them, when in fact, it was inevitable that eventually some universe would produce life, without design needed. Basically, there's a number of ways to address and frankly debunk the fine-tuning argument. But the question Braxton is posing, it isn't even really about the fine-tuning argument, so let's get to the actual question.
But yes, there are arguments on the other side that are meant to show that it's unlikely God exists or that God does not exist, like arguments from evil or divine hiddenness arguments. And so this puts us in an interesting spot. We've got arguments for and against. But as Philip Goff suggested recently, perhaps you have a God of limited power. This would mean you have really powerful arguments from God on the theist side, like the fine-tuning arguments. But then the arguments from evil and divine hiddenness no longer become powerful arguments for atheism. Instead, what they are arguments for a limited God, but not arguments for no God. And so there's no reason to take atheism seriously.
Okay, so what do I, as an atheist, think of the idea of a limited God? Well, that's exactly the reason why I'm an agnostic atheist. Because the idea of God can mean so many things to so many people, and I don't insist that every conception, definition, or iteration of something that someone could call God does not and could not exist. So now we're getting into a semantic discussion of what it means to be a god. Because most of the world's most popular religions today espouse the idea of an all-powerful, omnipotent God. And if we atheists then argue against that, then theists can just come back with, well, what about a limited God, but one who still created the whole universe? Then we atheists could argue against that. And then other theists could come back with, well, what about like a pantheon of gods, all with divine power, but none of whom created the whole universe, but they do rule over humanity? And then we atheists could argue against those gods. And then deists could chime in and say, well, what about a god that started the whole universe, but then dipped out and has no control or interaction with humans ever since? And then we atheists could argue against that god. And then other theists could posit other types of gods, and on and on and on we could go. And we could go round and round for hours and hours, eventually until exhaustion overtakes us, and then the theist camp could still say, hey, you atheists have not conclusively debunked every type or concept of God that has ever or could ever exist, so there's no reason to take you seriously. But again, we don't have to debunk and conclusively disprove every possible God concept to be an atheist. All we have to do is not be convinced that any God concept is real. So yeah, the problem of evil and divine hiddenness arguments, they're not great arguments against a limited God, but that's because they're not supposed to be. They're specifically geared at the idea of an all-powerful God, as is posited in most forms of Christianity or Islam. Saying that because those arguments don't work against the idea of a limited God as being reason to not take atheists seriously is like saying being against the gas-guzzling nature of Humvees doesn't apply to electric cars, so we shouldn't take the idea of investing in public transportation seriously. If you want to talk about a limited God concept, then talk about that. Don't expect arguments against an omnipotent God concept to be all that atheists have. Define this limited God in question, like exactly what do you believe their limitations and abilities to be, and then see what kind of refutations you're met with.
Question 2. Some atheist creators seem to think that the recent presidential election was so important that it changes the way they should do things on their channels. Watch.
I am going to be changing things up on YouTube quite a bit.
I am shifting gears a little bit here and widening the lens.
Why do you think that this election was so impactful to atheists in this way? What did it reveal about the culture?
Nothing. You have 2 examples there. 2 examples is not a trend. 2 examples of something is not a movement. It's not a commonplace thing. It's a coincidence. And having watched both Prophet of Zod and Christy Burke's videos where they announced the changes on their channel, I can tell you that in both cases, it was a personal choice that they had been considering since long before the election occurred and Trump won the presidency. I highly recommend viewers that you go watch Prophet of Zod and Christy Burke's videos where they are explaining the changes to their channel if you haven't already, but the Cliff's Notes version is that Zod has been feeling like making his change for a long while, feeling like he's said just about everything he wants to say on the realm of religion and atheism. Christy wants to branch out and talk about religion's impact on the culture, not just religious belief in and of themselves. As her last few videos have been about Christian nationalism, that shows the change she's making. And frankly, that seems like a natural extension of a counter-apologetics channel, to talk about how Christianity impacts the larger cultural landscape that we live in. I myself have chimed in on several social and political issues on my channel, and I've been doing so since long before the election took place. But I could run down the list of a veritable who's who of atheist channels that are still running business as usual ever since the election. People like Paulogia, Owen Morgan, The Line, Godless Granny, Skeptic, Sir Sick, Emma Thorne, Holy Kool-Aid, Genetically Modified Skeptic, The Antibot, Atheist Jr., Planet Peterson, Shannon Q, Rationality Rules, Alex O'Connor, Matt Dillahunty, The Magic Skeptic, Seth Andrews, and I could go on and on. Now, that being said, if there's any credence to the idea of atheist channels being in any way more focused on politics or the culture ever since the election, I would imagine the answer is what I've already touched on: Christian nationalism. There is a real and pervasive fear, and not an unfounded one, that the election of Donald Trump will empower, or at the very least embolden, religious figures and movements to further encroach on areas of society that we believe should remain secular. Braxton, I can't possibly be telling you anything you don't already know when I mention people like Ryan Walters, superintendent of public education in Oklahoma, who's insisting that Bibles be installed in every classroom and that they use them and teach from them. You can't possibly be unaware of Speaker of the House Mike Johnson and his numerous ties to far-right Christian extremist groups, like Exodus International, somebody he partnered with to put about an annual anti-gay event aimed at teens and a group that favors conversion therapy. If atheists are getting antsy about the current state of politics in the United States, it might just be because we're worried that the wall between church and state that we have to constantly defend, even though it was built into the First Amendment through the Establishment Clause, is closer to being torn down than ever before. And it shouldn't be hard to see why people who don't believe in your God would be concerned about legislation that impacts the lives of every citizen being done based on belief in that God and what those people think that God wants.
Question 3. Many atheists are determinists, meaning that they don't believe in free will, at least not of the sort that many people think of when they hear the term free will. They believe that the past history of the universe is like to a billion trains of dominoes or trillions of chains of dominoes that result in the past history of the cosmos, the formation of your physical body, your past life experiences, your neural structure, and the firings of neurons in your brain that are your choices, but could not have been otherwise. So here's my question. If you're a determinist, how do we hold people morally culpable for things they do that could not have been otherwise, given the history of the universe?
So I'm not exactly a determinist, at least in the way that you laid out. Nor do I believe in what was called libertarian free will. In order to believe in libertarian free will, that being the idea that the self initiates actions, but when acting freely is not itself caused to do so, human decision-making thus occupies a special place outside the natural order. Well, in order to believe in that, one has to believe in something outside of nature, or outside of a materialist philosophy. And I am a methodological naturalist, so I don't believe in such notions as libertarian free will. But I do believe in what I consider to be free will, which I would define as a being having the capacity to make decisions based on whatever criteria that they like, as long as those choices were not coerced by another thinking agent. Now, this type of free will allows for determinism. Say, for instance, I choose to eat a hamburger. Now, I was influenced to do so by my biological need to eat, and perhaps maybe being a little low on protein for the day, so I was craving meat. That's determinism. My biological drive impacted my decision-making. But as long as no other thinking agent was impacting my choices or coercing them, I still consider that to be free will. I could also choose to ignore that craving, say if I was on a diet. Now, that's still deterministic because it's my desire to be thinner or healthier or to live longer that's impacting my decision and overriding my desire for the hamburger. So then, how can we hold people accountable for their actions in a deterministic universe? Well, a number of ways. For one, as a corrective action. Say someone commits a crime, robbing a store for instance. Their desire for the money that they would get from the crime overrode their aversion to criminal acts or their desire to follow the law. So, by punishing them with temporary incarceration, or public service, or fines, or any of the variety of ways we punish criminal activity, that instills in them a greater aversion to committing crimes in the future. At least that's the hope, and we should put a larger focus on actual rehabilitation of criminals than we currently do. And this doesn't even have to go for, crimes in the legal system, but just any time someone engages in what most would consider bad behavior, such as being openly racist or maybe bullying others, for instance. They can be socially censured and face social backlash within the community, again as a corrective action, to make them see that acting in such a way will be more harmful to them in the long run, thus hopefully instilling an aversion to such behavior in the future. This is again totally in keeping with determinism. We're applying some form of punishment so that the memory of said punishment will act as a bulwark against such behavior in the future. But sometimes the offense is too great for rehabilitation to be achieved, like say a serial killer for instance. Well, even if they had a mental dysfunction that compelled them to kill beyond their will, they still pose a continuing danger to others. So, lifetime incarceration may be necessary just to remove them from the populace to ensure they don't harm anyone else. Then there's punishment as restitution. If someone, say, defrauds others, a punishment may be levied where they have to repay what they have stolen. This kind of holding people accountable is about restoring what they've put wrong. Even if they can't pay back monetarily for what they did, we have things like community service to attempt to labor an equal or greater amount than that which they cost others. And again, this can still work as instilling an aversion to such acts again in the future by instilling a dislike for the punishment such actions are likely to gain them. Frankly, the only kind of punishment, or holding people to account for their actions, that determinism wouldn't support is punishment for the sake of punishment. Or basically revenge, just doing something bad to somebody because you think they have it coming. Like, say, the death penalty. Ending someone's life because of offenses they committed does nothing to restore, rehabilitate, or protect society at large when lifetime incarceration can do the same thing. And I'm against the death penalty. Frankly, I'm against any kind of punishment that serves no purpose besides retribution. If anyone's motivation for causing any manner of suffering to another person is purely and entirely because they deserve it, then I'm likely to be against it.
Number 4, Richard Dawkins.
Are you okay?
I'm fine. I just threw up in my mouth a little bit.
Has long been praised by atheists as one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism. But recently he's caused some controversy with some comments about the trans debate. For many atheists, he's right about science when it comes to young earth creationism versus evolution, but he's wrong when it comes to this current cultural debate. Do you personally think he's right or wrong, and why?
There are people who believe in evolution, but believe that God is driving all evolutionary changes. I agree with them about the first, and I disagree with them about the second. There are people who think that germs, viruses, and bacteria cause diseases, but they also believe the earth is flat. I agree with them on the first, and I disagree with them on the second. A person can be right about one thing and wrong about another, particularly when the thing that they are right about is within their field of expertise, and the thing that they're wrong about is outside of their purview. I agree with Dawkins in his atheistic stance. The things he said in his books, like The God Delusion or The Blind Watchmaker, I agree with him. Those things are also in his area, him being an evolutionary biologist and in a position to argue, from a position of expertise, that life evolved naturally and there's no indication of any kind of divine intervention in how we did so. But Dawkins is wrong in his anti-trans stance, and that is something that is outside of his area, being as trans identity and gender identity as a whole is a sociological matter, not a biological one. Frankly, I think a big part of the reason he's wrong about his trans stance is because his mind is rigidly stuck in the biological. He can't seem to wrap his head around the idea that sex and gender are 2 different things, and he continues to erroneously approach the trans debate from a position of male and female, insisting on them being synonymous with man and woman, which they're not. How you feel, what gender you identify with, what socially gendered roles, traits, and behaviors you engage in are not determined by your chromosomes, and certainly aren't determined by what genitals you have. And since those roles, traits, and behaviors are socially gendered, that is, we place a gender value on those traits, roles, and behaviors, that makes gender identity a sociological issue, not a biological one. Dawkins is talking outside of his area. And so, I agree with him when it comes to not believing in God, and I disagree with him whenever he says anything about trans people, of which he should just shut the hell up.
Now, for this last question, there's a little bit of setup. Here's a quote from Robin Collins about the fine-tuning of the universe, and I'd like to know what your reaction to it is.
Well, I've already gone over fine-tuning quite a bit in this video, since you mentioned it earlier as a strong argument in favor of God's existence, but I guess we're going back to fine-tuning yet again.
Oh, goody.
Suppose we went on a mission to Mars and found a domed structure in which everything was set up just right for life to exist. The temperature, for example, was set to around 70 degrees Fahrenheit and the humidity was at 50%. Moreover, there was an oxygen recycling system, an energy gathering system, and a whole system for the production of food. Put simply, the domed structure appeared to be a fully functioning biosphere. What conclusion would we draw from finding this structure?
Okay, Braxton goes on about this analogy for quite some time, and I don't want to belabor the point. Suffice it to say, he's making an analogy between a biosphere on Mars and the Earth itself. If we would conclude that a biosphere on Mars had to be put there by some thinking agent, then we should conclude the same about Earth. Frankly, this is just a loftier derivative of the watchmaker argument. Finding a watch in a field leads to the conclusion that some thinking agent must have made the watch because it's too complex and specialized in purpose to be naturally occurring. Thus, the same is true for the planet itself, thus God. You're just substituting a biosphere on Mars for the watch in a field. I mean, this biosphere analogy is a bit closer to the planet than the watch is, as a biosphere is a life-sustaining environment like the planet, but the analogy is still flawed. If we found a biosphere on Mars, we would immediately set about examining it, studying it, going over every little nook and cranny, every speck of dust or molecule of air. We'd go over every nanometer of it 100 times and attempt to draw every piece of info we could from it. And if in doing so, it appears that
through some volcanic eruption, various metals and other compounds could have formed and then separated out in just the right way to produce the biosphere,
then we would come to the conclusion that it's a naturally occurring structure. If, however, the biosphere was showing signs of having been intentionally made, say, with elements being present that were unavailable in the area that the biosphere exists in, or the environment at large making it impossible for the structure to form naturally, we would then explore notions of it having been designed. Maybe by an advanced alien race, or interdimensional beings, or even through divine intervention. Now, when it comes to how our planet was formed, however, we understand every tiny little step in the process already. Earth formed about 4.54 billion years ago within a swirling cloud of gas and dust of the solar nebula. Gravity pulled this material together, forming a disk. Within this disk, tiny particles collided and stuck together, again through gravity, growing into larger and larger clumps. These clumps eventually merged into protoplanets. One protoplanet, destined to become Earth, continued to grow through collisions and the accumulation of materials, again through gravity. The intense heat from these collisions melted much of the material, causing it to differentiate. Heavier elements sank to the core, while lighter elements rose to the surface. A major collision with a Mars-sized object ejected debris that then formed the Moon. Over billions of years, volcanic activity released gases that formed the early atmosphere, and water vapor condensed to form the oceans. And in all that, there were a lot more smaller steps that took place, but again, all just as natural. See, the idea of a biosphere on Mars being intelligently designed is predicated on, and hinges on, the idea that it could not have formed naturally. So in order for the analogy to work, and to validly compare with our planet, it would have to be determined that our planet could not have formed naturally. And yet, not only could it absolutely have formed naturally, but in fact, all of the evidence points to that being the case. And as far as the idea of our planet being so finely tuned that the elements and properties at play on Earth seem to be balanced on a razor's edge for human life to exist, I mean, it shouldn't take a comedy and sci-fi writer to explain where you're going wrong, but I'll turn it over to the illustrious Douglas Adams.
A puddle wakes up one morning and thinks, this is a very interesting world I find myself in. It fits me very neatly. In fact, it fits me so neatly, I mean, really precise, isn't it? It must have been made to have me in it.
You see, Braxton, the Earth is not fine-tuned for us. The Earth developed the way it did, naturally, and then we arose out of it. We fit the Earth. The Earth does not fit us.
So here's the question. Are we wrong to think that this supports theism? If so, why?
Yes, you are. Because in terms of the idea of the fine-tuning of the planet, or the universe, or existence, etc., well, I've already gone over a number of reasons that it's flawed. A possible multiverse, the idea of universal constants being impossible to be different than they are, the universe being 99.9% repeating, inhospitable to life, and that we can only exist on one little mud ball of one little corner of the cosmos. And that doesn't exactly seem finely tuned. And there are lots of other ideas about the very nature of existence that also do not posit a creator being or anything that could be considered a god. So then, with that in mind, there's also Occam's razor, which gets misunderstood a lot and even misappropriated by theists when they misunderstand it. Oftentimes, theists will claim Occam's razor supports them when they say Occam's razor only says the simplest explanation is usually correct, and then positing that God did it is a simpler explanation than any naturalistic one. Much as you did with your biosphere analogy, you posited that it seems unlikely that any other explanation could be correct. But what Occam's razor actually says is one should not increase beyond reason the number of entities required to explain anything. All things being equal, the simplest solution is often the best one. Positing a creator God, even a limited one like from your first question, is unnecessarily multiplying entities. There are naturalistic explanations for how the entire universe and our planet and the life on our planet could come to be. To brush aside those explanations and instead insist on one that not only unnecessarily adds entities, such as your creator God, but that entity being literally the most radically, insanely complex being of all, is to grossly go against Occam's razor and supplant the most unlikely explanation possible. So that's where you're going wrong. So that was Braxton Hunter's 5 questions for atheists in 2025. There were definitely some in here that I hadn't gotten before, but I'm sorry to say they weren't great, such as the Richard Dawkins one. I feel like I've said this more times than I would care to, but Dawkins is not now, nor has he ever been, the Pope of atheism. It's strange to me how the only people who even bring up Dawkins, and I don't just mean since he became an anti-trans activist, but really in the last decade or more, are apologists. I mean, I've only been an atheist for about a decade or so, and Dawkins had nothing to do with my deconversion, and I really haven't had any interest in him in all that time, nor do I ever hear atheists talking about him, unless theists bring him up first. Also, asking a question that was based on Cameron Bertuzzi's take on atheism was weak, as next time, if you're going to lean on another apologist, at least pick one who acknowledges the existence of all atheists, rather than ignoring the existence of a large portion of us just because we don't fit into the philosophical box that he wants to shove us into. And, of course, the fine-tuning argument is something that's regularly been dealt with more times than I can count by a myriad of counter-apologists. And a more sci-fi derivative of the watchmaker argument is hardly treading new ground. But overall, I do enjoy Braxton's occasional questions for atheists, and I find him to be at least a bit more open-minded in his interactions with non-believers than other apologists. I mean, at least Braxton isn't out here saying that we actually all do believe in God deep down, and we're just suppressing the truth in our unrighteousness. So, at least he's got that going for him. And so that is where we'll end things for today. So thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like this video, comment, and subscribe so you'll always be notified when a new video comes out. Check me out on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Patreon if you'd like to support my work directly. My Teespring if you want some Plinky merchandise, all that linked below in the description. Special shout out to my most recent super thankers here on YouTube, Leo, Cold Loyalty, Autumnal Fling, Sir Alan Toon, and Salvi Mike. Also a big thanks and props to Mackie for their personal take on Plinky. Very cool work. I could never get the hang of making little light reflections in a character's eye or on reflective surfaces. I think you captured it very well, so thanks for sharing, Maki. And with that said, until next time, I'm Professor Plink reminding you to keep striving for greater understanding. It's the best way to get wherever you want to go.